This is the Queen's University Belfast LawPod. I'm your host, Maddy Kowalenko, and I'm joined today by Professor Jack Anderson, a specialist in the field of sports law. Professor Anderson has been the Director of Sports Law Studies at the University of Melbourne in Australia since 2017. Before that, he lectured at Queen's University Belfast for 13 years and also completed his PhD here in 2005. His key research area of interest is the relationship between sports and the law, and that's what will be the focus of our conversation today. It's a pleasure to have one of the world's leading experts and preeminent scholars in the field of sports law with us today. Jack, welcome to LawPod, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Although I'm sure many of our listeners watch or play sport, they might not have thought much about the legal issues that surround sport. Personally, I've always struggled to grapple with the legal framework that sport sits within and what law athletes are answerable to. So, Jack, I wanted to start today by asking you to tell us in a few sentences how you would describe the relationship between sport and the law.
Yeah, I suppose the first thing, to say that I'm one of these people, I don't believe there is this kind of discrete area called sports law. I think what it is the application of traditional areas of law, contract, tort, criminal, whatever, to this unique professional thing that is sport and this very unique pastime that is sport. So that's what I think of it, and anytime I'm trying to explain the relationship, even visiting a major event, the ticket that you have is a contract, that the stadium is a concrete bowl of intellectual property with merchandising and sponsorship. The players are employees of a club or they're under a collective bargaining agreement. There's disciplinary sanctions. And of course, the whole thing is underwritten by broadcasting deals, very complex commercial contracts. So, there's this, just in one little glimpse, you get to see, the applications of so many areas of law to sport.
Thank you. So just going on from that, what would you say then, like the top three issues that come up in sport or that are applied to sport and how the law can address them?
Yeah, I suppose, let's see, three. Well, the first one would be, look, sport is a great thing. To participate in sport is a great thing. Fantastic if you can make a professional career out of it. But I work with various international sports bodies, and I suppose the number one issue for us, sometimes we call them integrity issues, but the number one issue for us is safeguarding. It's that the people who play the sport can, first of all, play it safely. So if it's a contact sport, for example, the rules of the game, are as safe as you can be to eradicate the risks that you can, to prevent, immediate injury, and as we see with things like concussion, chronic injury. So that's really important, and that goes from a boxing ring to even a non-contact sport, so that's really important. But there's elements of safeguarding then that are unfortunate for us, and we've seen it in Ireland, North and South, we've seen it around the world, particularly actually in gymnastics, where there are certain coaches who, for various nefarious criminal reasons, take advantage of athletes, and that. So at the very, very height, it can be sexual abuse type nature, but also it can be a high performance environment whereby the coach is overbearing. So they're important safeguarding issues. And I think there's also kind of vulnerable athletes as well, be they athletes with various eligibility issues, disability issues, etc. So safeguarding is probably number one. The other issue is specific, I suppose, to professional sport. And that would be, if it's a professional sport, your number one aim is to keep your sport financially sustainable. So that's the number one issue. Because what we've seen from the research is if players aren't paid regularly, or if players are not paid at all, then they're susceptible to all sorts of kind of integrity issues. They may match fix, they may do other things that they shouldn't do. So financial sustainability is a big thing, but where do you attract the money from? And a big issue now in sport is, do you take money from private equity funds? Do you take money from sovereign funds, such as in the Gulf, for example? What issues does that bring in terms of your reputation? So those are kind of interesting issues. And that kind of relates then, I suppose, to the third issue, which is, and it's something that's really prevalent in Australia, probably same in the UK and Ireland as well, is that unfortunately, and even at a young age, we associate sport with gambling and gambling advertising and that. And we still haven't got that relationship right. When I was growing up, it was tobacco sponsorship of sports, then there was alcohol, and now it's gambling. You no longer have those as much, certainly not tobacco, but still a little bit of alcohol. But I think gambling will have the same discussion. The interesting thing, though, is gambling is so intertwined with sport. But I think they're the three kind of things: safeguarding, professional sustainability, and the kind of links that we have currently with they call it, I think, the gamblification of sport.
Okay, thank you very much. So that fits in quite well to some of the ethical questions I wanted to ask you about sport and how the law can address them. So in safeguarding, you spoke about the relationship between athletes and coaches, and I wanted to turn that specifically towards doping and how recently there's been a few scandals about doping in sport, especially in tennis, with Iga Swiatek and Jannik Sinner both facing bans for failed drug tests. And I wanted to ask about the extent to which you think athletes versus their coaches or the organizations that they exist within should be liable for doping charges.
Look, the prevalence of doping is a big issue. Historically, it's been an issue going back to East Germany, involving more recently Russia, etc. So it's always a thing. And the way the international community, the international sports community, decided to deal with it is to establish this body called the World Anti-Doping Agency, which kind of harmonizes rules worldwide, but also the legal principle of strict liability, which means that if you ingest something, you as an athlete, ingest something that is on the prohibited list, well, then the default position is that you are presumed to be liable. And the maximum penalty can be 4 years. So look at an athlete where, their career is quite limited. So that's what we decided upon, the strict liability. Now, since that, we've kind of come back a little bit from that. Look, sometimes the supplement can be contaminated. Sometimes it's unintentional doping. Sometimes there is a genuine excuse. Lots of times there isn't, but sometimes there is. And therefore it's not 4 years, but some lower figure than that, some mitigated figure. The Sinner case is a prime example of this. So Jannik Sinner's world number one. He's had a fantastic year tennis-wise. He, like a lot of these big famous tennis players, has a big entourage, masseuse, physios, etc., etc. So he's treated regularly by a masseuse. The masseuse has a cut in his finger. Masseuse uses a bandage to cover that. That's not really working. You can't massage someone with that. So he decides to use a spray to treat it. He was given it by the physio. Sinner knows nothing about this. And that cream that he uses to deal with the wound has a trace element of a prohibited substance. And obviously, by massaging Sinner's body, that's how Sinner ingests it. And therefore, that's why Sinner tests positive. So strictly speaking, because it's in Sinner's body, he's liable. But what happens is they look at the circumstances. He took his utmost caution. He couldn't have done any more. In fact, he didn't really know what was going on at all. This was all to do with his entourage, and therefore they reduced the sentence to virtually nothing. All right, so that's it. So they're quite complicated cases. The danger that a lot of people have identified with this is, and we've seen it in the past, whereby an athlete may blame someone in their entourage for giving them that substance. In other words, that you assign the blame to someone else, and how that avoids the whole anti-doping protocol system. So there's the things. But it's a difficult one, because with doping, I've done a few cases recently, but some of the key doping cases are people like Jannik Sinner, people like Simona Halep, the tennis player, people like Paul Pogba. They're celebrities. They've multi-million-dollar contracts. They can afford lawyers. If you're an ordinary athlete, you can't. And then you're faced with a 4-year ban. So there's an inequality there. There definitely is an inequality there. And perforce then the testing has become much more sensitive. So even minute traces of prohibited substances are being picked up. So you can imagine as an athlete, if you get that letter in the post saying we've detected a positive substance, we presume you're at fault, it's over to you. And where do you go or what do you do? So that's interesting. And that's where lawyers come in.
Also, you mentioned in safeguarding the issue of concussion, which is quite topical at the moment, especially to do with young children and younger athletes. So I wanted to ask you about consent and whether it's possible for athletes to consent to getting injured, and specifically with concussion, to the long-term health effects that repeated head knocks can have on people.
Yeah, it's a good question because before recording this, the week before recording this, Maddy, you probably know, but we'll have to explain for the others that the Matildas were playing, the Australian women's national team, soccer, football, proper football, were playing. And one of the Matildas who hadn't played for a while had a head knock in the middle of the game. And because she hadn't played for a while and she had just been back, she was desperate to stay on. And you can literally hear her pleading with the physio, please don't take me off for a head injury assessment. Please, please, please. And I think that is a fundamental issue, that when you have players on a field of play, they never want to come off. And in some ways that's understandable. It's easy to say they should know better, but it's understandable for anyone who's played sport to any decent level to understand why they want to stay on, as much for their teammates as anyone else. But that means that you have to have processes in place to override them, because at that stage they can't really give a proper consent. They're not properly assuming the risk, and you have to have the protocols in place, the independent doctors, to take them off in the system. And I think that's the way we've gone now, because historically what we've seen in loads of sports, in the US, in Australia, in the UK as well, that we have quite a group of athletes who have played contact sports 20, 30 years ago, who are now suffering severe neurological issues. I always say that some of my childhood heroes cannot now remember their kids' names because of the playing of football. And they've taken concussion actions, class actions or individual actions against the sport. And that is, for many Australian sports, definitely, and I know in the UK with rugby union, it's a huge issue. It's an absolute huge issue. It's going to be really difficult for the players. These historical cases are difficult. There's lots of causation issues which make it difficult. But the thing is, what can we do now in terms of ensuring that the young players coming into the game at community level are not suffering, and that those going into the professional game will not suffer the same? And I think that's hugely important. And it's one interesting case from Australia last year. A former NRL player, a guy called Keith Titmus, unfortunately died during an NRL training session due to heat exertion. And afterwards there was an autopsy done in his body and his brain. And we could see the beginnings of CTE, which is a sign of chronic injury of the brain. And Keith Titmus was 20 years of age, and so that was a real shock for rugby league, that a young player had stage 2 CTE, stage 4 being the worst. So there is a lot going on in that space. I'm not sure that the law or litigation is the way to resolve it. I think there should be some sort of settlement trust fund for former players, made out of current and funds, and that we deal with it in a non-litigious way and ensure that the rules of the game are developed, and that we eradicate and mitigate the risk as best we can.
I want to turn now to the question of financial sustainability of sport that you brought up as the second biggest issue in sports law at the minute. So in 2024, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime published its Game Over report, which exposed the linkages between corruption, serious and organised crime in sport, which I believe that you contributed to. We've seen in the past, whether it's FIFA or the IOC, that sports organizations seem to be kind of a hotbed for corruption. And you brought that up in your previous point about the financial sustainability of sport, and that when athletes or organizations don't have enough money, they turn to criminal means of acquiring that money. So is there anything else that you would say makes sport an ideal environment for corruption and crime to flourish, and what can ethics bodies or regulatory bodies do to address this?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So with criminal syndicates, either international or domestic, they don't really care if it's sport or whatever activity it is in society. They're interested in the vulnerabilities that it has that may lend itself to be a conduit for a crime. That's what they're interested in. So if you can launder money through sports gambling, they'll do it. If you can launder money by acquiring ownership of a club, they'll do it. If you can launder money by being involved in the transfer of a player transfer, they'll do that as well. And one thing that they think about sport, international criminal syndicates, is, yeah, look, there are international governance bodies, FIFA and all these, but actually they're not used to dealing with crime. They're not used to dealing with criminal syndicates, and they can't see everything, and that's right. So, taking the kind of your question in reverse, sport can't deal with this alone. Ethics bodies certainly can't deal with this alone. I sit in lots of ethics bodies for international bodies. I couldn't detect money laundering for you, but I can refer it to the police. And so working with law enforcement agencies, which is what the UNODC is trying to promote, is exactly the way the sport will deal with it. But, we've seen various types of crime and corruption, particularly over major events as well, how bidding processes, supply processes, there's all sorts of ways around it. But I suppose one of the interesting areas is this match fixing area, whereby you have criminal syndicates, this is proven, in Southeast Asia or other places, who generally make money through narcotics internationally, and they want to launder the proceeds of that. Sports gambling is a great way to do it. But of course, if you can bet on a game that you've already fixed, you can then launder money on a game and make profit on that. It's almost a perfect crime. So you've got these international criminal syndicates approaching individual players. Cricket and tennis are prime examples of this, getting them to fix events or parts of events. And then, because you've got the inside information, it's like insider trading. You know the way it's going to end. You can bet accordingly and make money. And so that's just a small prime example of the element of crime and corruption in sport. But of course, it's like any area of society. International sport is a multi-billion-dollar industry. Sometimes it's quite loosely regulated, self-regulated. It's not able to deal with these scenarios. Sometimes it doesn't want to deal with these scenarios because of the reputational impact. And therefore, there's no surprise that there is an element of crime and corruption therein.
So in your experience, would you say that sports organizations generally are willing to work with law enforcement to prevent corruption and crime or match fixing within their sports, or is there kind of still a reluctance from those organizations to engage with traditional law enforcement agencies?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think traditionally sports bodies were always a bit reluctant because you never want a bad story, and if you pull the thread, who knows where the match fixing thread will end, but I think more and more as they become aware of it due to work by the UNODC, etc., they are willing to work with law enforcement, and they are more than willing to hand over these really complex cases to law enforcement. And Interpol and these other agencies are quite willing to work back with it. But on a national level, not all law enforcement agencies have the capacity to do this. If you have a sports bribery case or a match fixing case, there's very specific knowledge that you need. There's very specific legislation that you need. And in the absence of that, lots of law enforcement agencies kind of go, unless we tie it into a money laundering scheme generally or organized crime generally, we're not maybe as enthusiastic about it as we should be. And what we're trying to tell them in sport is that a lot of the organized crime gangs that they're interested in like to use sport as a conduit for crime and corruption and could be quite weak on that. There's a vulnerability for them as well. And therefore, if you go and investigate what they're doing on their gambling sites, if you go and investigate what they're doing in terms of owning clubs or running sports, well, then you might actually get an insight into their larger business practice. And therefore, there's a mutual benefit for sport and law enforcement agency to engage in cooperation in dealing with this. And we've seen some good examples of it.
So, if we could turn now to women in sport, which is one of the issues that provides probably the most commercial opportunity for sports organizations going forward in terms of how fast women's sport is growing and the consumption of women's sport is growing. So
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, how can the law adapt to better address the gender gap in sport? So I'm thinking of the key issues of pay gap, parental rights for athletes, and sexism within sports governance generally, particularly at an executive level.
Yeah, the evolution of women's sport over the last number of years has been, terrific, unbelievable. Even at a kind of a professional level, certainly here in Australia and the US, and yeah, absolutely in Europe as well. I think though, and I think you're right, that the actual structures of sport are struggling a bit to catch up. And struggling a bit to deal with the level of participation and interest in women's sports in terms of physically making pitches and equipment available. That's one thing, which is really interesting in that sense. But also in terms of rule changes and governance. Just because certain rules apply to a men's version of the game doesn't necessarily mean they apply to the women's version of the game. But the lazy way is just to say, oh, copy that. Similarly, with governance in sport, just because a men's sport or a sport that has been traditionally dominated by men should be governed in this way doesn't mean it should be governed like that in the future. We've got a lot of issues like that, and I even see things like we've seen quotas come in at board level trying to promote better gender balance within sports governance, etc. But I've even seen it myself because I do a lot of arbitration in sport. And one of the things that we often get in arbitration in sport is a player, usually a male player, will bring a sport into dispute, sometimes by not very nice activity in private life, usually against women. So they're brought up on a dispute charge for the sport. And I always think there's three men here sitting on this panel judging another man about his attitude towards women. And actually, it's one of the things I've found in sports dispute resolution and arbitration that there's a gross gender gap there. Women make up 50% of the playing population. That's not the case when it comes to resolving disputes. And it's a shocking statistic, but at the highest level of sports dispute resolution, which is this thing called the Court of Arbitration for Sport, 95% of appointments to hear cases are men. And that's just shocking that your biggest, highest court has such a gender gap. So it's unsurprising then that back down along you see all of those type of issues. And there are specific issues. For example, with concussion, there is evidence that the female brain suffers more grievously with contact, and therefore why do we have a dearth of concussion research on that, for example? There's evidence with ACL injuries, which may be linked to the way the football boot is. So there's lots of issues there that need to be teased out. And so we're trying to think about those almost on the foot at the minute. And a side issue then, not so much a side issue, that's a terrible way to explain it, but another issue that is related to it is the whole transgender issue as well in terms of gender. And that lots of sports bodies seem to be distracted or well taken with that eligibility issue to the detriment sometimes of greater participation in the sport. So it's a difficult balance at the minute. But I think a lot of sports are surprised in a patronizing way, actually, at how interested people are in women's sport, because traditionally that was the thing. Why would you pay to watch that? Why would a broadcaster pay to watch that? Here in Australia, the number one sporting brand is the Matildas by far, and I suspect you'll see that in other countries as well.
Thank you. I think the issue that you raised in terms of arbitration with men who've committed crimes against women in sport speaks to a larger issue with the culture problems in men's sport specifically. And I know here in Ireland we've seen recently the case with Conor McGregor. So what do you think are the kind of mechanisms and issues that the law can address to specifically change those kind of thought processes within governance to involve more women and to protect women? And do you think that decisions in courts can have an impact on the culture and society's willingness to accept those kind of crimes committed by male athletes because of their status?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. I think what we've seen a lot of in Australian sport and in the US sport is male athletes behaving badly in terms of sexual assault, and how does that affect their contractual status? And so we've seen sports have to do a lot of work with civic society to educate its players and to update its regulations accordingly. But it's not easy, it's not easy because, you've given the example of the Conor McGregor, but I was just thinking how quickly people forget because, we had Mike Tyson fighting on Netflix. Mike Tyson has a very poor past when it comes to women. And looking at all the coverage around the Netflix fight, so-called fight, it was hardly mentioned. There was almost a nostalgia that Mike was back, rather than face the facts that he is convicted of crimes against women. But at the same time, what I think, and I'm not avoiding your question because it's a difficult question to answer and lots of sports have struggled with it, but at the same time on that Netflix program, the better product, the better fight was the Katie Taylor fight, which gives you the example that there is a demand and a high quality within women's sport. And I think in a way, the more you promote that equality, the more you assist women in so many ways in sport. But I think you're right. In terms of holding people accountable, one of the things that I find with lots of sports bodies is that players are assets to them. They invest a lot in them, and they will do a lot to protect the brand and protect themselves. And that's not always, or is rarely, good for the victims in question. So it's a difficult one, and it's a one that sport, maybe sport reflects society in that sense, which is the terrible thing to say in some ways. And so sport has to be part of the wider conversation there. But lots of sports still struggle with that. And I'll give you an example of this. One of the examples they have legally in the US, in Australia, is that where a player, say for example, a player is facing a serious sexual assault charge, should the player be allowed play pending the trial? And the argument now is no, you suspend them, you stand them down pending the trial. And what we found in lots of clubs is they go, okay, that's fine, player suspended. But people working in a club still have to work with that person daily, including women, and find it uncomfortable to deal with a player who has been accused of something serious like that. So they're really complex and difficult issues. Law isn't always quite helpful, and often it is the club to do the ethically right thing in the circumstances, which is the most difficult thing.
You mentioned that maybe sport and people's behaviour and fans in sport is a reflection of society. And I wanted to turn that towards the issue of racism and diversity in sport. So I'm thinking, for example, when you said that, I thought of the racism with Adam Goodes in the AFL, who was a very successful and highly acclaimed AFL player who faced booing from entire stadiums towards the end of his career, which essentially then led him to retire. There is a problem within sports with inclusion, diversity, and racism. And I wanted to ask you what sports organisations can do at a policy level to encourage greater diversity in their participants, not just at the elite level, but also at grassroots level. And can you think of any successful examples of sports organisations who've managed to increase diversity within their sport?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So obviously, Adam Goode's an Indigenous player, and what is interesting is that currently in Australia, the AFL is struggling to attract young Indigenous players. Part of it, when it comes to diversity and inclusion, can be cost of entry into a sport. And I think sports, particularly at community level, are increasingly aware of that. Part of it is to be a relatively safe environment as well. That when I go to sport and play sport with my mates, it's not my identity in any way. It's that I'm a sports person and I'm playing that. And so you've got to work on that. And also that sports bodies speak out about diversity and other areas and take a bit of leadership on it, because they do have a voice. They do have an extensive membership and they do have a good reputation generally. And to take a lead on issues like that is hugely important. But it is an extremely difficult issue because with so many things in society now, it's the extreme dominates. So for example, if we're talking about, say, transgender athletes, at a community level, including transgender athletes is not an issue. It becomes an issue at the elite level for various different kind of reasons. But if you listen to the extremes, you think it's the biggest issue in sports. We've just had a US election where, it became an issue, save women's sports and all this kind of political manipulation of the issue. So I think with diversity and inclusion, it is up to sport to kind of take the moral lead, but also do the practical stuff in terms of making your sport more accessible for all, in terms of cost of entry, in terms of who it welcomes, and in terms of leadership from its elite as well. So I think that they can do a lot. And you know what? Most sports do. Most local sports clubs are probably the most welcoming entity in your local community.
So where do you think that gap kind of comes in, especially when we're talking of race between the local level and the higher levels? So where does that gap between like the welcoming and inclusive environment of grassroots kind of start to fade away?
To be honest, if I knew the answer to that, I'd make a lot as a sports consultant. And I'll tell you why. Even here in Australia, there's a huge fall off in cricket in Australia in teenage years for girls and boys because it's such a long game. There's a huge fall. But the biggest growth area, there are two big growth areas in women, female young athletes, but also in the Indian population in Australia. But there is a gap between that mass participation of the Indian community in Australia in cricket at grassroots teenage level and actually making it up to the elite level. And English cricket has the same. But what is interesting is what Cricket Australia has found with participation levels among a traditional area falling, it's going to have develop a plan. Because actually what it's found is the more diverse and inclusive it is, the stronger it is in terms of participation and the stronger its future will be. So actually, as was being taught and preached and told for decades, the more diverse a base you have, the more diverse a membership you have, ultimately you will be a stronger unit.
Diversity is the future for a lot of sports, and I want to turn to another issue to do with the future of sports that's slightly different, and that's the rise of esports. So just for some context for our listeners, the esport industry in 2023 was worth about $3 billion, but it's projected to grow by 19% annually, bringing its total value to $6 billion by 2030. And its viewership for 2025 is projected to reach 641 million. Also in 2025, the inaugural Olympic esports game is scheduled to take place in Saudi Arabia. So I wanted to ask you, Jack, what you think the legal challenges are with the regulation and professionalization of esports. And do you think that esports pose a threat to traditional sports?
Yeah. So esports is essentially competitive computer gaming. And as you rightly say, it's a huge industry, an absolutely huge industry. First of all, esports doesn't care about what traditional sports thinks about it. That's the first thing. It doesn't care. And there's lots of reasons for that. The first reason is esports is a collective name for various games. In a way, with traditional sports, you can, without getting too legally loose with it, but you can say that FIFA owns football. You can kind of say that, or you can say the AFL owns Australian football, and all those kind of things. But no one owns esports. The ownership of esports lies with the publisher of the games. So the key relationship in traditional sports is contract law. The key relationship in esports is copyright law. And so it's a completely different industry. Which is interesting. The legal issues are a lot of these players are young players, and so you don't want them to be kind of abused in terms of the contractual relationships they have with teams. They just want to play this game. They want to play this game endlessly. Their career is very short. It's very young. You don't want them kind of exploited by other things. So that's the key issue. There's also some integrity issues as well. A little bit of doping and a little bit of match fixing as well. But generally, the issues are that it's not what you would recognize as a governance issue. Governed in a traditional way. For a while, traditional sports became kind of interested in it and tried to kind of do partnerships with esports, and that fell away because neither entity kind of understands each other. But the International Olympic Committee has been very interested in it. And the International Olympic Committee is very interested in it for two reasons. First of all, and you mentioned the kind of quasi-Olympic games and all that. It's interested because esports are very popular in very populous areas of Asia who traditionally wouldn't have an Olympic history, but are quite high-spending, consumer-driven young populations. So they're really interested in that, which I think is an interesting thing. The second reason why the IOC are interested in it is that the future of sport will, now I probably won't live to see it, but you will, hopefully, is a combination of esports and virtual reality. So, and already they're playing around with this. So if because of climate change there's no more snow, well then it's going to be done in a computer simulation. If in the future combat sports are done away with because of concussion, it's going to be done in a computer simulated thing. And you've already seen this, you've seen kind of big cycling tours which are done online. You've seen various other sports. So I think the combination, the future of sport will be esports, virtual reality, and what we see traditionally as sport. And that's sport reflecting technology in society.
All right. I just want to finish off by asking you a few rapid fire questions.
No problem.
So first of all, what is the emerging area of sports law that excites you the most?
I think the AI issue, I think that's going to be how you market sport, facial recognition in sport, how you identify talent, how you identify injuries in sport. There's so many uses for artificial intelligence in sport. Some are good, some may be bad, but that's an issue because it engenders privacy, human rights, data protection, all those types of areas of law, including the biometric data that athletes generate.
Secondly, what's the best piece of advice that you can give to students interested in a career in sports law?
Three things. First of all, if you're a law student, even if you don't want to practice law, get admitted as quick as you can. That's the first thing. If you're interested in sports law, first of all, become the best lawyer you can, ideally a commercial lawyer, and then eventually a sports law brief will come across your desk and off you go. So always keep an eye on that. And thirdly, in the immediate, lots of students ask me this, and I always say volunteer. Volunteer at your local club, review their policies, represent them in a tribunal, sit in a tribunal, do a contract for your friend who's an athlete, do all of those kind of things, and then eventually the work will come to you.
Thank you for that. And finally, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest, what sport would you give a 10 out of 10 for most legally challenging, and what sport would you give a 1 out of 10?
Yeah, I suppose, look, something like boxing really under our criminal law shouldn't exist. And it has very, very interesting contract situations where you see lots of boxers being exploited. And I think doping issues are always interesting in boxing. If an athlete is doped, they'll just be 50, 20 meters ahead of you. There's no harm done, really. If you're facing a dope boxer in a ring, it could be fatal.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. Professor Anderson, thank you very much for joining us at QUB LawPod. It's been really interesting to talk to someone with your expertise on sport and the law. I think it's fair to say that we've covered a lot of ground in today's episode. We've heard about safeguarding, governance, criminal and commercial law. I've really enjoyed hearing your insights on how those areas of the law interact with sport, and I hope our listeners feel the same. That concludes our LawPod episode on sport and the law. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next time.